Do you believe in the paranormal? Have you ever felt the chill of supernatural energy? Do you think the spirits of murder victims can reach out from the afterlife and help to avenge their deaths? If the answer is yes, then today's episode will be on your street. Hi, and welcome to Mysterious 7. I'm Michael, and today I'm going to take you through 7 cold cases of homicide that were solved by psychics in the most unexpected ways. So let's get right into it. Invariably, Gerard Croiset, the renowned psychic detective, is given nothing about the crime he is asked to help solve. Instead, the only clue he is given is the object usually covered or wrapped and placed in his hands. Nevertheless, on hundreds of occasions, Croiset has had accurate images of the crime as it was committed and of the only person responsible for it. His list of successes is long and impressive, and the authenticity of his skill as a psychometrist cannot be doubted. In 1949, he was given 2 wrapped bundles and immediately said the objects inside were a tobacco box and a blanket. He correctly identified the owners of the tobacco box, who were 2 brothers, and he also described the house in which they lived. Croiset added that the blanket had been used to abduct a small girl who was then taken to a cowshed and sexually assaulted. Using Croiset's information, the police promptly apprehended the molester. One of them committed suicide within a week of his conviction, and surprisingly, Croiset predicted that. In June 1958, Croiset was asked to hold a pair of red slippers. He said, "These shoes belong to a pretty young woman. She was murdered in her home outside a big city in America, near a body of water, by a bushy-haired man. The slippers belong to Marilyn Shepard, the victim in one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. On the 4th of July, 1954, she had been battered to death in her home on the shore of Lake Erie in Bay Village, a suburb of Cleveland. Marilyn's husband, Dr. Sam Shepard, served 10 years for the crime he vehemently denied he had committed. He always claimed that the murderer, who had beaten him unconscious, was a bushy-haired man. In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the verdict against Shepard. On the 25th of February, 1961, came Croiset's most famous and most disturbing case. Croiset helped the New York police trace a missing 4-year-old girl named Edith Kiecorius. Through a series of transatlantic telephone calls, he pinpointed where the girl's dead body could be found. Precisely as Croiset had foretold, the girl's body was there. Through the description he gave, the murderer was quickly arrested and later committed to a hospital for the criminally insane. Although Croiset was invited to the U.S., he deliberately chose not to make the trip because he felt he would choke on all the impressions. Yet he could identify streets and buildings in New York, even though he had never been to America. It often happens that although Croiset's images are correct, they cannot further the cause of justice. He has at times confirmed police suspicions as to the identity of a criminal, but although he has provided vitally important information, it may not be enough to obtain a legal conviction. Nonetheless, he continues to contribute his psychic insights to homicide cases when asked, since it can provide valuable leads for the investigators involved. In yet another strange case of this nature, the family of a man missing for more than a year believed that they found his remains in remote central Australian mountains after they followed a clairvoyant's directions. Leanna Adams led them to the location of the corpse. 36-year-old Thomas Braun disappeared on November 17, 2000, when he walked out of his girlfriend's house 6 kilometers west of Honeymoon Gap near Alice Springs. Relatives found human remains they believed to be of Mr. Braun, 20 kilometers west of Alice Springs in the West McDonald Ranges. Following the clairvoyant's directions, 3 relatives found the skeletal remains in less than 2 hours on top of the range near Larapinta Drive. "He was found on the top of a mountain. We are so relieved," Mr. Braun's cousin, who declined to be identified, said at the time. "We had asked police to search the area where he was last seen, but they did nothing." The cousin said a Braun family member took the clairvoyant to the area where Mr. Braun was last seen. The clairvoyant said she had met an Aboriginal spirit lady who asked her to help find Mr. Braun. So how did she know where to go? In 2001, when the body of Thomas Braun was located by Perth-based Aboriginal clairvoyant Leanna Adams in Western Australia, it was after the trail had already gone cold. Police had initially been unable to find the body. The family of Braun had been told to contact Adams, an Aboriginal psychic who lived in Perth. The Braun family had requested police to do a search based on Adams' directions, but they had not assisted. Adams went to Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, which was 3,600 kilometers from her home in Perth. She took the family members directly to Braun's remains, a spot high on the ridge west of the town, some 20 kilometers out. The remains were not immediately identifiable. Police later confirmed the remains to be his using DNA testing. The family expressed their profound gratitude to the psychic for helping them find their loved one's deceased body when the police had given up. But Leanna Adams said it was the spirit of the dead person who desperately wanted to be found, and she was just the messenger between him and his family. In the early 2000s, a young Australian woman named Maria Scott was a resident at Triple Care Farm Youth Rehabilitation Center at Robinson in the Southern Highlands. While she had previously struggled with drugs, she worked on improving her life at the rehabilitation center until the 27-year-old tragically went missing. In October 2003, her decomposed body was discovered wrapped in a quilt and dumped in bushlands on the grounds of Triple Care Farm, having been badly beaten and stabbed 5 times. For more than 4 years, Scott's killer remained at large. Then, after investigating other suspects, including Scott's former partner, Jason Mayer, authorities began to suspect that a man named Mark Braun was involved. Braun was a staff member at Triple Care Farm who had been living on-site at the Wairarapa Lodge in 2003, less than 200 feet from where Scott's body was found. Braun had a history of violent behavior, but without definitive proof, the police could not confirm his involvement in Scott's murder. After 4.5 years, with no developments in the case, the investigation took a strange turn when a psychic medium named Debbie Malone stepped in to help with the case. Malone had previously appeared on the psychic investigation show Sensing Murder, which caught the attention of Detective Senior Constable Jeffrey Little, one of the detectives investigating Scott's murder. Little invited Malone to consult on the case. She was given a bangle that had been found on Scott's body. Simply holding the object, she could provide specific details about the case. Malone reportedly led authorities to the location where the murder had occurred, pointing out blood on the walls, and even directing authorities to look in the drain pipe, where they discovered the knife that had been used to take Scott's life. Even more strangely, Malone told detectives that she could feel the killer's spirit walking through her, which told her that the killer himself had since passed on, since Malone could only feel ghosts walking through her. This revelation only confirmed authorities' suspicion that Mark Braun had been the killer, since he had committed suicide 4 years before. Her description of what happened was close to what we had found, and I included it in the coroner's brief. I don't know whether he noticed it, but she was brilliant. She told us how the body was positioned in the bush, where it was found, and what Maria was wearing. Little said at the time, adding, what we hadn't told her was that the key suspect had committed suicide. I was extremely skeptical at first, but then I couldn't explain how she knew these things when all we gave her was a bangle. And now we come to the case of John List. Psychics do a good job convincing people that they can predict the future, contact the dead, or even help find a killer. Numerous accounts of mysterious murders lead the police to call in psychics, but unfortunately, each case turns out the same. The psychics' broad claims do not help find the killer, and they often waste police resources. But one other instance in particular is the case of John List, a man who shot his wife, mother, and 3 children. List left them to be found in his mansion with a letter confessing what he had done to his minister. John's daughter Patricia was one of the victims. Patricia's teacher reported her missing when that 16-year-old didn't attend school in November 1971. Police went to List's New Jersey house and found the entire family dead, except for the patriarch John, who'd vanished, leaving behind a note of confession. John List somehow eluded law enforcement for nearly 2 decades before Detective Jeffrey Hummel, who worked the case, sought the assistance of psychic Elizabeth Lerner. Lerner saw a vision of List with a new woman in Virginia, where he was eventually found and brought to justice. List expected to be caught almost immediately, but ended up starting a new life with a new identity. However, the case in his hometown did not die, and one detective took a lot of interest in the case. The detective had heard about a psychic living nearby and decided to bring her some crime scene photos and get her input on the matter. Although she had a few leads, she did provide him with some interesting information. The psychic, Elizabeth Lerner, claimed that John had met a new woman. He had traveled by plane to the southwest, likely since John lived in Colorado, and she claimed there was a significance about Florida or Virginia. As it happened, it was true that John ended up in Virginia, where he was eventually arrested. Lerner had also told the detective that she was convinced he would visit the gravesite of his old family on his birthday. Since the psychic's other information was accurate, the detective got permission to watch the graveyard the day before and the day after John's birthday. He never arrived. A few years later, John was finally caught because a neighbor had recognized a picture of him on America's Most Wanted. In this case, people who believe in psychics can claim that Lerner was right, since some of her details were accurate. The detective did not only ask for Lerner's help. A psychologist had also assisted him in trying to figure out clues to lead to List. The psychologist, who had come up with the idea that List had moved away from his hometown and that he had met a new woman, Lerner went the extra step and predicted his visit to the graves. List never planned on visiting the graves, but the detective wanted to believe Lerner's claims so badly that he wasted 2 days staking out the gravesite. Of course, it can be assumed that anyone who knows the ways criminals behave could have made such assumptions, because sometimes killers will return to visit past lives. List was just not one of those people. This is just one example of how psychic crime detectives are used, and there are more that produce the same unfruitful results. However, their confidence and strong ability to convince people might be their absolute power. In April 1983, Mary Cousett from Alton, Illinois, disappeared after leaving her home with her boyfriend, Stanley Holiday Jr. Little is known about Cousett's case. However, Holiday was arrested and would confess to her murder. The only problem was that the investigators could not find the 27-year-old's body. After 7 months of searching, the police took an unusual route. They called in Greta Alexander, a woman with known psychic abilities. Greta was locally known for her talents and for often helping the needy. She had once been a housewife and mother until a peculiar incident occurred. While pregnant with her 5th child, a bolt of lightning struck her room. Although she insisted that she had psychic abilities since childhood, she claimed the lightning awakened them. Soon, Greta turned her new talents into a full-fledged career. Now, her skills were needed to find Cousett's body. Greta had been assisting police with missing person cases since 1974. She never charged the police for her services. Greta Alexander circled an area on a map and told investigators to search there. Furthermore, she gave them 22 clues about Cousett's body that cited its condition and how it would be discovered. It included her foot and head that would have been detached. Greta also stated that whoever would find Cousett would have a bad hand and that the initial S would be important. On the 29th of October 1983, Mary Cousett's body was discovered in Peoria, Illinois. Interestingly, policeman Steve True, who had a deformed hand, found her. Cousett, a mother of 2, had been stabbed to death. Her foot was missing, and her skull was found a few feet away from the rest of her remains. In other words, most of Alexander's predictions had come true, and police heavily credited the psychic for finding Cousett. One detective said that he is now a believer. Greta herself said Cousett was waiting to be found. However, not everyone was convinced of her abilities. One skeptic later wrote that many reports had failed to mention the predictions that had not come true. Moreover, Cousett's body was found far off from the area where Alexander had initially circled. Despite her critics, she would continue her work with the police and the community until her death in 1998 at 66. "I was skeptical to begin with," said Alton Detective William Fitzgerald, "but I guess I'm going to have to be a believer now." Police said that murder charges filed in Madison County against the woman's boyfriend, 29-year-old Stanley Holiday Jr. of Alton, would be dismissed so he could be prosecuted in Tazewell County, where she was stabbed to death. Mrs. Greta Alexander said she had received a lot of impressions in the case. "This young woman was waiting to be found," she said. "The spirit never dies. It lives on. She was saying, 'Here I am. Come find me.'" Fitzgerald said Mrs. Alexander told him the body would be found near an embankment a river, a bridge, and something to do with a church. She said the body was not attached to the head and was missing a foot or leg, all of which turned out to be true. To many, Greta Alexander became not only a telepathic genius, but a heroine who helped the cause of justice through her connection to the spirit world. In the next case, it was in 2005, the year Ashley Howley of Livonia vanished near Columbus, Ohio, when Kristy Robinett says she was shaken awake by the 20-year-old's ghost. Robinett claims she's seen and been able to communicate with ghosts, angels, and spirits that haven't yet crossed since she was a toddler, but this is the first time it led to her involvement in a criminal investigation. The investigation discovery show, Restless Souls, covered Robinett's beyond-the-grave interaction with Howley. Kristy Robinett communicates with the dead, says the episode's summary. One night, the ghost of a young woman appears and asks Kristy to help solve her murder. As the ghost gives her clues, Robinett goes on a terrifying journey as she tries to bring the woman's killer to justice. Howley, police would learn years after her death, was murdered by her boyfriend, Robert P. McMichael II, who also killed his mother and her boyfriend. I was sleeping and got awoken by this girl who said she had been murdered. She needed help, Robinett said. I was kind of stunned and not understanding what was going on and what I was supposed to do. Although spirits often appear to look human, Robinett says this girl had a gray tint and was particularly translucent. I could tell she was a spirit, and she had not crossed over, and she hadn't passed over to heaven, or what we call heaven, said Robinett, who grew up in a strict Christian household in Detroit. It led her to search for a missing girl in her 20s with blonde hair on the internet. She came across Howley and knew immediately it was her. After contacting the police and providing information and a description of Howley's clothes, the police put Robinett in contact with Howley's family. Then they began investigating with and without police. Robinett says Howley, a stripper in Ohio, wanted her remains to be found so that she could be put to rest and her family could find closure. And she wanted her killer, who was her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend at the time, to serve time, Robinett said. She was a little bit revengeful. Howley visited Robinett fairly regularly throughout the next years and presented images of light-colored pines where her body was. Robinett said she took a trip to Columbus with a relative of Howley's. They were stopped by a park ranger where they were looking. No light-colored pines were in the area, but he knew where some were, said Howley. Finally, they found the right spot, or at least Robinett said she could feel it, but authorities wouldn't dig because it was on private property. She said it was about 2 more years when McMichael was arrested for the other murders and offered a plea deal before he revealed the location of Howley's remains, right where she had shown officials years earlier. Robinett has since worked on other investigations, all pro bono. She says it's often under an agreement of confidentiality because law enforcement doesn't want to deal with a backlash from taxpayers for using mystics in their investigations. I think everyone has psychic abilities, says Robinett, who once considered her visions a curse, but is now more frightened of the living than the dead. Robinett, who spent 2 decades working as a human resource professional, quit becoming a full-time psychic in the mid-2000s. She also weighed in on the mystery of the missing Malaysian jetliner once. I talk to those who are dead, so if I don't sense anyone deceased, that is a positive thing, she said. I still don't think the plane is in the ocean. I think it's on an island somewhere. In our last case, clairvoyant Dennis McKenzie has never forgotten breaking the worst possible news that any parent could hear. When Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman went missing in Soham in 2002, Dennis was called in by Holly's family to help. He knew almost instantly that something terrible had happened. As well as seeing the dead people who supposedly walk among us, Dennis claims he has psychic visions, which wash over him in breathtaking clarity. When he deals out a hand of his spiritual cards onto the red tablecloth, the fog of the future lifts for a moment, and Dennis starts to get a picture of what lies in store for his subject. Dennis says he has used his psychic powers to help police investigate 32 separate crimes, including the Soham murders in 2002, and the case of the BTK killer, a serial killer who bound, tortured, and killed women in Wichita, Kansas, and evaded the police for over 30 years. 90% of people who claim to do what I do are charlatans, Dennis shares. The other 3% are nutters, and the final 7% are legitimate. Dennis McKenzie helped the police solve the murders of Howley and Jessica. I am sorry, but both girls are dead, he told their families. During the agonizing days before the bodies of the two 10-year-olds were found, Dennis came up with a remarkable set of insights. I described the caretaker, Ian Huntley, who would be convicted of the murders, and his girlfriend, Maxine Carr, he says quietly, without a hint of pride. I also described the view from Huntley's house, his red Fiesta, the Fenland Road he drove along to dispose of the bodies, and the site where he dumped them. So accurate were his readings that Howley's father Kevin has said publicly that Dennis is the genuine article. He gave Dennis's information to the police. Dennis has since gone on to investigate murders and disappearances all over the world. However, Dennis still charges a modest £40 for a reading and does all criminal investigation work for free. He vividly remembers the day when he was asked by a friend of the Wells family to help locate Howley. She and Jessica had gone missing from a family barbecue on the afternoon of Sunday, August 4th, 2002. I was hoping my spirit guide would give me some good news, but as I got closer to Soham, I had a heavy feeling of foreboding, he explains. As I got out of the car, I heard my guide saying in a very clipped, precise voice, "They're dead." I felt sick inside. When I found myself in Kevin and Nicola's presence, I asked them how direct they wanted me to be. They begged me to be straight with them. I had no option but to break the news. Back then, I had never, ever had to say anything so terrible to anyone. Words cannot describe my feelings. Dennis went on to say that the girls were dead by 7:30 p.m. on the day they disappeared. He described a woman with a shrew-like face and brown hair, and a man in his 30s with low intelligence who walked with a swagger. He described their accents as northern. Both Ian Huntley, their murderer, and Maxine Carr, his girlfriend and accomplice, came from Humberside. Dennis also told the family the girls had been transported in an old red car, wrapped in something like carpet or bubble wrap. He described the view from the house where they had been killed, with a ditch outside the window and a tall building like a windmill with no sails in the distance. There was a grain silo outside Huntley's cottage, which did have a ditch running alongside it. Kevin Wells relayed the information to the police. The girls' bodies were found in shallow water just as Dennis had predicted. Dennis remains friends with Kevin, who thanked him for his remarkable contributions during my darkest days in his book, Goodbye, Dearest Howley. So what do you think of the psychics who helped solve the crime? Are they telling the truth or constructing an elaborate set of lies? Let us know your opinions in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more episodes of the strangest incidents of true crime right here on Mysterious 7.